And so I want to be as helpful as I possibly can as we look at the theology of work. The theology of work. So we have a situation here in the church at Thessalonica that the Apostle Paul is dealing with. And apparently, well, not apparently, in truth, there were some folks there that were not working. They were not working. They were not earning their own living. Instead, they were causing trouble. He says they were not busy at work, but busybodies. And so there's sort of a little wordplay there. It's in the wordplay in the Greek, and it comes over in English. They weren't busy; they were busybodies. They were meddling in other people's business and not working. And the Apostle Paul says, "Look, we need to cut it out. Stop it. Get off your couch, get a job," right? And so he's dealing with this problem that they have there in Thessalonica. And it wasn't the first time they deals with this. You notice what he says here in verse 6 and in the following verses, that he says, look, this isn't the first time I'm dealing with this. I told you this when we were there. I'm telling you this again, especially that little phrase that you're probably familiar with. If a man is not willing to work, neither should he eat. And so he says, this isn't the first time I've said that. This isn't some little item off to the side. This is a key issue that needs to be addressed, that needs to be trumpeted, it needs to be understood by the entire church. And so it's such an issue that he repeats it over and over. So he's stressing it that way. And he elevates it even to the level of, look, if somebody's not listening to this, and if they're not working, they're able to work, and they're not working, and they're causing trouble, this rises to the level of a church discipline issue. And we looked at church discipline last week. If you didn't check that, go back on Facebook. The video is there. And check that out. And so he says this is a serious matter. Now, what was going on in the life of the church that was causing some of these folks not to work? Was it sheer laziness? Maybe. And the Bible speaks very directly to that. We'll talk about that a little bit before this study is over. But most scholars agree that probably what is going on here is some bad theology. And they connect, and I think there's a good case to be made. We don't know this 100% sure that this is the reason, but it seems like the reason is in chapter 3 is connected to the problem of chapter 2. So the problem in chapter 3 is connected to the problem in chapter 2. If you remember, the problem in chapter 2 was their eschatology was all out of whack. Their understanding of the day of the Lord and other things was distorted. They thought that the day of the Lord had already come. And so whether that resulted in them being depressed and not wanting to work, or they thought that they were super spiritual and didn't need to work, or they were just going to sit on the roof wait in their pajamas and waiting for Jesus to come back. I don't know exactly what was in their mind, but and that kind of thing happens in our day as well. And it seems to kind of go in cycles from every generation or so. You can look back in Christian history. Every generation or so seems to get this infatuation with the second coming of Christ, and so much so that it gets distorted and twisted to where you have people saying, hey, look, Jesus is coming back any minute. Why have kids? And why raise a family if Jesus is coming back? And why plan for the future? Why get a job? Why plant a tree? Why pay your bills? So those kind of things creep in. Is that what was taking place in Thessalonica? Maybe. It's a good possibility. And if that was the case, well, I'm going to make a case in a minute that it was some messed up theology no matter what. If it wasn't their eschatology that was a mess, at least their theology of work was a mess. And we know that because it played out. And that's where I want to kind of put a footnote here, kind of an extended footnote, because before we deal with the main topic that I want you to see. And now the extended footnote is that theology matters. Theology impacts the way that you live your life. What you believe affects how you live. And notice how I said that. Theology impacts your life. I'm not saying it should. I'm saying it does. Sometimes we say it should, and that there's a case to be made there too. But I'm saying it does. No matter what your theology is, if it's good theology, It might affect you in a good way. If it's bad theology, it's going to affect you in a bad way. So whatever your theology is, it affects you. And the reason I point that out is because I think that many times we have this false notion. I hear it sort of under the surface from a lot of people that you kind of have theology on the one hand, and that's good, that's fine. You can study theology if you want. That's kind of a fun little hobby for people like Brother Don. Theology geeks that get into all the details of everything. But what we're more interested in is just loving Jesus and living our life and raising our kids, and we can leave all that academic stuff to the people up in the ivory towers and all of that. No, listen, your theology is going to impact your life. If you have just a superficial theology, just an inch-deep, shallow theology, it's going to affect your life in negative ways. Jesus taught this. The Apostle Paul taught this. Jesus, for example, let me give you an example. And this is why I say that it's so important for Christians to understand the gospel and understand the gospel inside and out in a deep way. I know some people say, well, look, you asked Jesus to forgive you your sins. He died for your sins, and that ought to be good enough. Why do we have to learn about justification and the difference in justification and sanctification and effectual calling and all of those kinds of things? It's because the better you understand the gospel, the better you understand the mechanics of how your salvation works, the more it's going to impact your life in positive ways. And here's the example that I was going to give you. Remember the story, I won't turn to it, but remember the story that Jesus tells about the guy who owed a lot of money to the king. He was in debt up to his eyeballs. There was no way for him to pay it back. It was impossible, humanly impossible. And the king forgave him of his debts, just washed them away, just wrote it off and forgave him. Then the guy turns around. Remember the story? The guy turns around and finds somebody that owes him a little bit of money. Just a small amount of money, $20 or something like that. Yeah. And what does he do? Does he forgive him? No. He goes out, finds him, tells him, you better pay up. The Bible, Jesus actually says he's choking him. So this guy's going choking him, and you're reading the story, you're hearing the story, and you're like, you've got to be kidding me. This joker just got forgiven for all of this money, this extraordinary debt that he couldn't pay. And then he's going to treat this guy that owes him a little bit like that. That's just not right. And so that's what Jesus wanted you to see. That's not right. Well, how does that affect and that's what happens in our life. We've been, as Christians, and I'm gonna give the benefit of the doubt. You're a Christian, and you understand the gospel at least at some level, but it really hasn't taken effect in your life. You've been forgiven of your sin, but you haven't really thought through the depth of that. You haven't taken the time to understand the depravity of your soul. This is where the doctrine of total depravity is important. And you see the gravity of your sin. And it's not just those big external sins like, stealing something or something, but those sins that we would call respectable, that Jerry Bridges calls respectable sins of pride and other things, that how heinous that is against a holy God. And that Jesus Christ came and forgave you of your sin because he paid the penalty. And when we go through the gospel in our life, then it's going to affect the way that we treat other people when they sin against us. Jesus himself, even in the Lord's Prayer, said that there's a connection there. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. There's a connection there. And so the deeper you understand the gospel and appreciate what Christ has done for you, imputing to you his righteousness. When someone sins against you, when someone says something, and you realize that the reason they said that is because of pride in their heart, and they were trying to belittle you and make themselves look good because they were coveting your reputation in the world, little things like that, you can appreciate that and you can be more sympathetic with them. And you're not going to go and choking somebody because they owe you $20 or want to choke somebody because they said something against you. You recognize they're a sinner. They're a sinner. And when you understand that, it's going to affect the way that you raise your children. because they are sinners. It's going to affect the way that you interact with your spouse, because you recognize they are sinners. And when your husband forgets to take out the garbage when he said he was going to do it, you're gonna be more compassionate there and understanding, because we've been forgiven, you see. And so my point being is, theology matters. Theology, the better we understand theology, the more impact it's going to have in your life. And that's definitely true with the theology of work. We're going to see in a minute. But before we do that, let me come back to two other reasons why these guys in Thessalonica may not have been working. Maybe it was because their eschatology was messed up, and they were misunderstanding the day of the Lord and all the rest. But some others have indicated that possibly it was some Greco-Roman culture that was creeping into the church, existed in the church because of the Greco-Roman culture that they lived in. That in those days, it was sort of a caste system where you had, the upper echelons people. They didn't really work. They just had servants, and the servants did the menial labor, and other work was above them, and they were too good for that. Kind of like on Gilligan's Island, Mr. and Miss Owl. They're not going to be bothered with the little menial things. And so that was part of the Greco-Roman culture there. And perhaps that was creeping into the church, and people were acting like that, sort of this caste system, where some people in the church thought they were just better than everybody else, and the other people, they could do the work, and they were just going to sit back and sit on their couch and drink champagne and have everybody else work. And the Apostle Paul says, "Nuh-uh, that ain't how it works here. That's not how the church is set up. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. There's an equality here. Now that doesn't mean that some people don't make more money than others. Absolutely. Some people are more skilled than others. Some people need to do certain types of tasks, and other people need to do other kind of tasks. There's a division of labor and all the rest. But there's no place for someone to think that I'm better than you are." In any way, shape, or form in the Christian life, if we understand the gospel. If we understand the gospel correctly. You see where I'm going with that? Or perhaps, maybe it wasn't the Greco-Roman culture that was influencing them. Maybe it was the Jewish culture. Because they tell us that during this time period, there's sort of this thing about, there was some, without going into all the details of the false doctrines that were creeping in, not only to the Jewish community, but even into the early church. There was this dichotomy between the spiritual and the physical. And the spiritual was good, and the physical was bad. And so they saw that, and so some super spiritual people, I'm putting that in scare quotes, super spiritual people said, we're not going to bother with just the physical things of life. We're going to dedicate ourselves to the spiritual things, and we're just going to go sit on this rock over here and think about spiritual things, and now they still had to eat. And so they're mooching off of other people while they're doing that. And this really took root in, say, the 3rd, 4th century in Christianity. That's where the monasteries started to develop, where people would say, these super spiritual, and they would call themselves that, they're going to go and just cloister and let everybody else pay the bills. And what Paul is saying here to the church at Thessalonica, no, that's not how it works. Everybody needs to pull their own weight. Everybody is in this together. We need to cooperate together, help each other out. When there's times of need, and we're going to talk about this maybe next week or the week after, when there's times of need and calamity comes and other things, sure, we're to help each other out. But everybody needs to work. Everybody needs to produce. Everybody needs to take care of themselves, provide for your own family, and earn your own living. That's what the text literally says: earn your own living. And so, what I want to do today, with the time that I have left, what I want to do today is really make one major point, and that is that work is good. Work is good. If I want to put it in the negative sense, I want to explode the notion, knock the legs out from under this idea that work is bad. That work is bad. And a lot of people have this idea, work is bad. They want to avoid work at all costs. Everybody's working for the weekend. You've seen bumper stickers. It says, I'd rather be fishing, or I'd rather, whatever. And you'd rather be doing anything except for work. And work is a drudgery, and it's bad, and nobody wants to do it. And even when you talk about this to Christians, and you might already be there with me, doesn't the Bible say that work was a curse? Let's actually look at that. Let's start talking about the theology of work. And a good place to start, you know where I'm going to go, to the beginning. So let's turn to Genesis. Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1. When we start to think about the theology of work, we'll start at the very beginning, the theology of work. What does Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So now, let me break that down, put it on the bottom shelf. At the risk of sounding overly elementary, God is a worker. That's the very first thing that we hear in the Bible about God. That He did something. He created something. He made something. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so, point number one, under this theology of work, point number one, God is a worker. God is a worker. Now, creation isn't the only work of God. You can take any good systematic theology, and it will break down all the things that God does, that God's a worker. Not only has He created the universe, and we're not deists who think that God created the universe and then just step back and lets it do its own thing. No, He continues to sustain it, continues to actively sustain His creation. We can turn to Colossians, where it talks about how He holds all things together by the work of His and word of His power. And so He is sustaining and preserving. All of these things require the work of God in the world. His interaction with us on a daily basis through His providence. Not too long ago, I'm trying to remember when it was, but not too long ago, we talked a great deal about the difference between providence and miracles. That providence is how God typically works in the world. And He is at work. He is at work. But He's working through all the laws of physics that He has created and all the rest. But then sometimes He goes outside of those boundaries and performs a miracle. And so that's what a miracle is. And so God is at work, not only in miracles, but also in the works of providence, which is actually blows your mind even more if you start to think about all the intricacies that God works together for good to those that love Him and are called according to His purpose. And so the work of providence. And then the work of judgment. The work of judgment. God is a judge. He is sitting on His throne, judging the world. And that is work. That is work. Might not be moving rocks around, but judging is work. And I think that's helpful to think about when we think about our work. Work is not only physical labor, and this discussion comes up especially between blue collar workers and white collar workers. The blue collar workers that are out there outside digging a ditch or working out in the plant or something else, and they look at the guys in the office, and they're just drinking coffee and sucking up air conditioning. That's all they're doing, just sitting back making decisions. That's all they do. Well, making decisions is a lot of work. Making the decisions is a lot of work. Now, I understand the frustration that comes from you're out there breaking your back for minimum wage or something, and there's a guy who's enjoying the air conditioning, the coffee, and everything else, and making double what you are. I can understand. I understand the frustration there, but the truth of the matter is, we need to understand that making decisions is work. Planning is work. Doing those things is work. That's a legitimate work. And God is our example there of a worker. Not only does He work through the acts of creation, through sustaining the world, through providence, through miracles, through His providence, through judgment, and judging sin and righteousness, and the work of redemption, of course, through Jesus Christ. And so God is a worker. God is a worker. And here's the reason why that's so important and why I belabored that so much and hammered it away so much. Because of the next step, I want to remind you, human beings, you and I, were created in God's image. That's number two. We're created in God's image. There, if you're still with me in Genesis, look at Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. It says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And so we're being created in God's image. That's point number 2. I also have point number 3 in this. I'm going to go ahead and read this, and then we'll come back to it and explain it. He says, and let them, this is even before he created them, this is his plan, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so let's deal with those 2 big points that I want you to see there. Number 1 is that we were created in the image of God. We were created in the image of God. What does that mean? What does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things. And without getting sidetracked on all the different things that being created in the image of God means, for our discussion today, the important point that I want you to see is, if God is a worker, and he created us to show forth his image, to show the universe what God is like, then we're to be workers. I know that sounds simplistic, but that's how it works. That's what we were created for, to show forth those communicable attributes of God to the world. Let's go back to the 10 Commandments. I'm always going back to the 10 Commandments, because everything actually goes back to the 10 Commandments, law and gospel, right? And so if we look at the law, if we look at the Old Testament law, the 10 Commandments, why does God say, for example, honor your father and your mother? Because God does. Within the Trinity, that intra-Trinitarian relationship within the Trinity, the Son honors the Father. Therefore, God created a universe with individual human beings, with individual persons that related to one another, and he commanded us to honor our father and our mother. Why? So that we would reflect the image of God. You see? Or why do we have the 7th commandment? Not to commit adultery. Because God is faithful to the ones he loves. You see? Why do we hear the commandment, the 9th commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness? Because God is a God of truth. He is truth. Jesus himself said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You see? And so we are to reflect the image of God. And if the very first thing that we hear about God is that God created, that God worked, then we're to work. We're to work. This is before the fall, remember? This is before the fall. This is before everything went wrong. This is before everything went wonky. This is God saying, this is my intention for you to work. And he explicitly said that. And so that's my third point so number 1, God is a worker. Number 2, we were created in the image of God. Number 3, we were created to work. We were created to work. He says there to have dominion, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and to subdue it and take dominion over it. This is the creation mandate. Now, sometimes people look at that phrase, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, and they think that all that's talking about is having kids. Well, that's part of it. That's part of it. To have children and have a heritage and a legacy and fill the earth, but it's more than just having children. It's subduing the earth, and those children are a means to that end, to subduing the earth. Because the ultimate goal is, Isaiah tells us, for the knowledge of the glory of the Lord to cover the earth like the waters cover the sea. And so God created man and woman in his image, and he places them in the garden. Chapter 2, verse 15? He places them in the garden to work it and to keep it. Yeah, look at Genesis 2:15. To work it and to keep it. And so this is, again, before the fall. This is before everything goes wrong. God gave human beings the responsibility to work and to keep the garden. You know, I think there's this misconception about the Garden of Eden that Adam and Eve are just, sitting back doing nothing until the fall. And they're just, they're just sitting around, naked and smiling, and having a good time. Laying out on the beach, eating frozen grapes. I don't know. That's not what they were working. They were working. That's what God told them to do, and to fill the earth. And so you kind of have this idea. And this picture of the garden being this walled garden that Adam and Eve had a responsibility to expand over the whole earth. You see, that was that was the creation mandate. And you even have, and it's an interesting study to trace out the garden versus wilderness motif throughout the Bible. And so that there's a garden, and think about the difference between a garden and the wilderness. It has the same things. In the wilderness, there's trees and different things, but a garden has purpose and utility to it, and it's being tended. The wilderness is out there just wild and wild animals and danger and all the rest. But man is to subdue the earth, conquer it, and make it serve Him for God's glory. You see, and so that's the creation mandate that was given to work it and to keep it even before the fall, But then the fall does take place. We see that in chapter 3. So what happens in Genesis chapter 3? You're still there in Genesis. Let me read it for you. Genesis chapter 3, verse 17. Well, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Let me tell you the story, and then I'll read a particular passage. You know the story. Adam and Eve are given dominion over the garden, and they're told not to eat of one of the trees. And I think it's important to point out that there was only one tree that God said don't eat of. And so everything else was fine. Everything else was open. God said yes to everything. It kind of makes me think of Courtney and I when we were raising our kids. I kind of had the tendency when the kids would ask for something, my tendency would be to say no, unless there was a good reason to say yes. Courtney was the opposite. She would want to say yes, unless she could think of a good reason to say no. And so that was kind of our difference there. And I realized that in essence, she was reflecting God's outlook on things lots better than I was. Sometimes we think God says no to everything. The 10 Commandments, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. But if we back up and look at the big picture, there's much more that God says yes to than He says no to. So anyway, there in the garden, there was one tree, and He says don't eat of it. And what do? They eat of it, of course. And so you know the story. The serpent, Satan, tempts Eve with the fruit, and she partakes of it. They have this theological dialogue there, and her bad theology affected what she did. And so then she gives it to her husband, and he partakes and eats and plunges the universe into sin. Right? And so when God gives a judgment, He judges first the serpent and gives the proto-evangelion there, the proclamation of the gospel before the gospel. And so that the son, or the seed of Eve, the seed of the woman, will eventually, Satan will bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. And so we have that there. And then, of course, he talks to Eve and says, in childbirth, you're going to have pain in childbirth. She would have had children anyway, but now it's going to have to be painful. But let's look at what he says to Adam, because this connects to that creation mandate. Remember, the mandate was to subdue the earth, and he had all of this stuff. He could eat of every plant, and it was made for him for food, and he had dominion over it, and he was to subdue it for the glory of God. Now let's look at Genesis 3 after the fall. Here is what has taken place in verse 17. It says, and to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Notice the difference there. Before, you still had to eat of eat of the ground. He wasn't dropping manna out of heaven at this point. That was a miraculous thing that was done later. But in the garden, he was still having to tend the ground and eat of its produce. But now it's done in pain. Now it's done in pain and toil and difficulty. Look at verse 18. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. So you return to the ground. From out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and dust you shall return. And so, what is the difference there? It wasn't that they didn't work before and now they have to work. No, now the work is more difficult. Now the work required the sweat of his brow. Now he has to endure thorns and thistles and weeds and all the rest. Which brings up an interesting question I was asked one time. And it took me, and I remember this was a long, long time ago. Somebody asked and I really didn't know. I'm like, I don't know. And here's the question. And now I think I know the answer. And the question was, in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, in Genesis chapter 1, God says that man can eat of all of the plants. Every living thing was food. And here's the question. Wait a minute. Some plants you can't eat. They're poisonous, or there's no nutritional value. It make you sick. So what's the deal? And I'm like, well, maybe there's just medicinal things that we don't know about yet, which is probably true. But another part of it is because that was said before the curse. That was so the dangerous things were not in existence. They mutated, and God mutated them, and because of of sin in the world, and now the whole universe groans for the day of redemption. And it's under a curse, you see. And now it takes wisdom to know what you can eat and what you can't eat, and how you need to process it and all the rest. But it's all there. It's all there. But now it's more difficult to produce it. And that's what happened with the fall. And so my bottom line here is just a simple message. And I've said all of that just to say one very important thing. Work is not bad. Work is good. Work is what we were designed to do. And like I said, I'm not just talking about getting a job with an employer and punching a clock and getting paid a salary. I'm not talking about just that. That's a part of it. That might be part of it. It might be owning your own business. It might be anything from subsistence living, growing your own food and everything. That's work, to owning your own business and everything in between. But we were designed as human beings to work, to produce for ourselves and for others. And we'll look a little bit more about that, Lord willing, next week and the weeks to come as we can continue this study of the investigation of the theology of work. Let me leave you with one passage from Psalms to kind of emphasize this, that work is a blessing, not a curse. Look at Psalm 128. Psalm 128, verse 2. Psalm 128, verse 2. You shall eat the fruit of your labor, of your hands. You shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. This psalm puts in synonymous parallelism being blessed by God and eating the fruit of your own hands. Eating the fruit of your own hands. And we know this. If you work, or if you've ever done a project and you finish and you say, I did that. I produced this. Those of you that grow your own food in your garden, how much better it tastes than stuff that you grow that you can buy at the store. Now, part of that is because of the growing methods and all the rest. But I'm talking about just the satisfaction of knowing I grew this. I made this. I'm providing for myself. I'm not begging for a handout. I am working for my own and providing and making my own living. I was trying to remember how the ESV quotes 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. To earn your own living. To earn your own living. That's